Well, you often hear us talk about dew point, and sometimes you hear us talk about relative humidity. What do they mean? What's the difference between the two? Well, first, let me show you dew points. Now, dew points look somewhat similar to air temperatures because they're both measured the same way, in degrees. So when we are reporting this on the news, you are looking at a dew point, which is degrees Fahrenheit. Typically, when you get above 60 degrees in the dew point department, that's when it starts to feel a bit humid outside, a little bit more tropical. If you get above 70, oh, it really starts to feel tropical outside. So that's the dew point, kind of a humidity gauge, if you will. There's a whole lot of science in association with the dew point as well, but just from a practical standpoint, it's a humidity gauge. Now, relative humidity, you would think to yourself, oh, well, this is how it feels like, right? If the relative humidity is 80%, it must be really humid, right? But if the relative humidity is 40%, well, there's probably not much humidity in the air. That is incorrect. And that is why we typically never talk about relative humidity on the air. Let's dive deeper into this here. So dew point, as I mentioned, it's a measure of moisture. You use it as a humidity gauge. Again, when the number is above 60, you know it really starts to feel humid. When it gets above 70, it really starts to get tropical. Relative humidity, however, is different. Relative humidity is how much water is currently in the air now versus how much water the air can hold at the current temperature. So think about that for a minute. Relative humidity is indeed relative, right? It's relative to the current air temperature. So think about this for a second. In the morning, relative humidity levels are typically at their highest. Why is that? Because the air temperature is at its coolest, right? So the temperature is, in effect, closer to the dew point, making the relative humidity higher. Now consider this scenario. It's a summertime day. It's 90, 95 degrees outside, and the dew point is 60 or 65. Well, the relative humidity is not going to look very high on a relative humidity map percentage-wise because it is relative to that 90-degree temperature. Does that make sense? So it may feel extremely humid, but you're saying, well, why does the relative humidity only read 40% when I'm basically sweating like crazy walking outside? It's because the relative humidity is just that. It is relative to the current air temperature. Now, dew point, on the other hand, just to go back to that quickly, yes, that is number one, the point at which dew forms. So it's called the dew point. So in the morning hours, temperature cools to the dew point. The air can't hold any more water, so it condenses out into tiny water droplets known as dew on the ground. That's also the case when you have fog, when the air temperature and the dew point are equal, so the air can't hold any more water, so it forms a stratus cloud on the ground known as fog. Relative humidity from an operational standpoint, so as meteorologists, we really use relative humidity for wildfire forecasting. When it gets so dry, especially relative humidities of 25% or below, that's when wildfire danger really becomes an issue. So you look at relative humidity, you look at what the current drought conditions are and wind conditions. All of those really come together to produce some intense wildfire type days, potentially, if everything comes together. So that's what we use relative humidity for. Dew point, you want to use that for everything else. How humid it feels outside. I haven't touched too much on the science of dew point in terms of from a forecasting standpoint, but when you get the really humid air in place, dew points above 60, that now you're in thunderstorm range, if you will, for lower cloud heights, which that can impact tornadic type weather and things like that. So there's so much more to dive into at a later date with dew point. But again, just what you need to know right now, use dew point for everything. Unless you are looking at a wildfire type situation or a grass fire situation, dew point is where you want to go. Tell your friends, tell your family, the higher the dew point, the more humid it feels, but don't look at relative humidity. Again, it can be very confusing and quite misleading unless you're talking about wildfires.